In 1956, the world's superpower empires were completely blind, marching directly into a conflict everyone thought was impossible, a disaster that was about to trigger World War III. While Washington and London ignored the signs, one brilliant Canadian diplomat saw the blueprint of the collapse and warned them all. They laughed at his warnings until the bombs started falling. This is the untold story of Lester B. Pearson, the mastermind who predicted the unthinkable, defied the global elite, and single-handedly saved humanity from the brink of nuclear war. Topic 1. The desert chessboard and the hidden fuse. To really get a sense of the danger looming over the planet, we've got to hop back in time to the sweltering heat of Egypt in mid-1956. The Suez Canal, one of the most vital shipping lanes in international trade, was suddenly nationalized, sending a shockwave of panic through the offices of the great European powers. Man, oh man, Britain and France saw that bold move as an intolerable insult to their old colonial dominance, and started scheming a violent military response behind closed doors in the world of geopolitics. The mood was pure fury and wounded pride, with the most seasoned leaders acting purely on the emotion of the moment, ignoring the risks of a full-blown conflict. Holy smokes, this tense scenario is the perfect metaphor for those moments in our own lives, when everyone involved gets so blinded by ego that they can't see the cliff edge right in front of them. In classic books on leadership and the psychology of control, like Machiavelli's famous The Prince, we learn that acting in the heat of anger is the fastest way to torch any big business plan. While the war tanks were being secretly prepped, almost nobody realized that messing with that chessboard in the Middle East would set off a super dangerous domino effect between the United States and the Soviet Union. The fuse of World War III was lit in the desert, and the superpowers were strutting proudly straight toward disaster. That collective blindness among the dominant nations created the perfect environment for a completely different approach to gain traction in the hallways of the Department of External Affairs in Ottawa. Far from the spotlight, with both feet firmly planted in reality, one man was poring over those diplomatic reports with a cool clarity that was way out of the ordinary. Whenever the traditional powers decide to settle their disputes through pride and brute force, fate usually ends up sending humanity a massive bill. A perfect storm was brewing on the horizon, but that seasoned Canadian was already sketching out a quiet counter-response before the first shot was even fired. Topic 2. The ignored warning and the diplomat's loneliness. Understanding the real weight of seeing things ahead of everyone else means accepting the uncomfortable burden of preaching in the wilderness, while everybody around you is celebrating an illusion. Behind the scenes in London and Washington, the seasoned Canadian negotiator tried to warn his allies that a military invasion of Egypt wouldn't be a show of strength, but rather the opening act of a global geopolitical collapse. Geez, the European ministers, full of themselves and clinging to a fading colonial past, just shrugged off the spot-on analysis coming out of Ottawa, brushing it off as excessive caution. He found himself in a spot of total diplomatic isolation, watching the war machine get fed by the blind pride of the powerful. That painful lack of anyone listening teaches us a valuable lesson about our own path. Strategic thinking often rubs people the wrong way when they'd rather stick with easy, comfortable, quick-fix solutions. In foundational books on the psychology of big decisions like Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, it's crystal clear how overconfidence blinds leaders even when the risks are laid out in black and white. If he'd caved to the pressure and mockery from the international elite, modern history would have taken a catastrophic, irreversible turn. Instead of backing down in the face of isolation, the Canadian kept his focus rock solid, knowing full well that time would eventually prove his warnings right. Wow, the stubbornness of the superpowers went so far that the attack plans were sealed in a secret pact, deliberately ignoring every single warning memo sent from Canada. The plain hard truth is that the leaders figured the crisis would be wrapped up in a few days, with a crushing win and no real fallout to speak of. Little did they know that arrogant stubbornness was about to shove the two biggest nuclear powers on the planet into a direct, apocalyptic showdown in the days ahead. The world's chessboard was about to catch fire, and the ignored prediction was mere hours away from becoming a real, full-blown global nightmare. If you agree that Canada has a fascinating hidden history that the system tries to keep buried, join our community and subscribe to the channel right now. We're on a beautiful sprint to hit our first 1,000 subscribers and prove that Canadian audiences are here for deep investigative content, and your subscription is the vote of confidence we need to keep bringing these truths to light. Topic 3. The world on the edge of the nuclear abyss. In October 1956, that terrifying premonition became a violent reality with the joint bombing and invasion of the Suez Canal by British, French, and Israeli forces. The Allies' secret plan blew up right in front of the whole world, sparking an immediate, furious reaction from the Soviet Union, which publicly threatened to fire nuclear rockets at European capitals. Holy cow, the entire planet froze in panic, realizing that the collapse of global peace wasn't some distant possibility anymore. It was a reality just hours away. The United States, blindsided by the audacity of its own allies, suddenly found itself on the brink of getting dragged into World War III. That terrifying escalation shows us, in real terms, how a lack of control and diplomatic isolation can turn a regional disagreement into a tragedy of biblical proportions for everyone involved. In moments of extreme crisis in our own lives, keeping a cool head and taking a containment approach is what separates surviving from total, complete ruin. If you're going through a rough patch in business, for instance, the worst mistake you can make is reacting on gut instinct instead of using your head. The plain hard truth is that the world had no leadership left, and the usual channels for dialogue had simply melted away under the impact of the bombs. Geez, the vibe in those tense days was that humanity was marching straight toward its own extinction, all because of the wounded pride of a handful of leaders. While the Soviet war machine was mobilizing and panic-gripped Canadian and American citizens alike, international forums seemed completely paralyzed and powerless. But it was right there, at the epicenter of that total chaos, that the outside-the-box vision of that persistent diplomat from Ottawa found the opening it needed to act. Time was quickly running out, and he knew he'd have to pull an unprecedented solution out of his hat before the first atomic missile crossed the skies over Europe. Topic 4. The masterstroke at the UN and the birth of the Blue Helmets. While the bombs kept falling, and the whole world held its breath, the brilliant Canadian strategist took the stage at the United Nations General Assembly with a game-changing proposal tucked under his arm. Instead of just condemning the attacks or sending more troops into combat, he used his unique vision to propose creating a completely neutral international military force. Man, the idea was to send soldiers whose only job would be to stop the fighting and keep the peace, not wage war. And that's how the legendary UN Blue Helmets were born. It was a stroke of pure political genius working behind the scenes, one that managed to disarm the superpowers' pride by offering them a dignified way out of the conflict. That brilliant move stands as the ultimate real-world example of how true leadership solves complicated problems, by building bridges where everyone else only sees walls they can't get past. In classic books that have shaped the mindset of great leaders, like Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People, we learn that disarming your opponent with diplomacy is 1,000 times more powerful than trying to beat them through brute force. To put that same wisdom into practice in your own life, you should always look for the third way in everyday conflicts, focusing on mutual give and take instead of a head-on clash. The Canadian plan defused the looming collapse and changed the course of geopolitics forever. Wow. That strategy was so bold and overwhelming that both the Americans and the Soviets had no choice but to back the resolution put forward by Canada. For the first time in history, international peacekeeping troops landed in the desert to separate rival armies without firing a single shot in aggression. That masterstroke stopped the Suez fuse from turning into a nuclear holocaust, proving that the smarts of a young nation could shape the course of the entire planet. The victory behind the scenes at the UN was total, but the personal cost and the true impact of that achievement still had some deep surprises in store for our hero. Topic 5. The Nobel Peace Prize and Canada's forgotten diplomatic legacy. Word of that brilliant vision didn't take long to cross borders, and in 1957, the fearless diplomat was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, lifting Canadian pride to the top of the world stage. The International Committee recognized that his quick thinking behind the scenes at the UN was the only real barrier standing between the world and a humanitarian collapse of atomic proportions. And yet, the tragic irony of time is that, as the years rolled on, the memory of that massive achievement got gradually pushed down into the footnotes of the traditional textbooks. Man, oh man, it seems like the newer generations have forgotten that the modern model of global peacekeeping was born from the brilliant mind of a guy from Ontario. That historical amnesia hands us a deep lesson about how a lack of respect for our own touchstones can weaken our sense of identity and our collective strength. In books that inspire personal growth and building a lasting legacy, we learn that you should always protect and celebrate past victories in order to keep your mind shielded against the mediocrity of the present. If we don't make the effort to pass this story of courage and brilliance on to our kids, we'll let the system erase the greatest proof that our country can lead the world through sheer smarts. The silence surrounding his journey is a warning sign of a society that's lost track of its own destiny. Bringing the historical impact of Suez back into the spotlight is an urgent call for every one of us to start valuing depth and strategy again, instead of settling for shallow, surface-level solutions. The story of this man who stood up to the pride of the imperial superpowers proves that a leader's real power doesn't come from the size of their army, but from the clarity of their purpose. Man, it's on us to keep his example alive and kicking, using it as inspiration for the big decisions we need to make in our everyday lives. The saga of the man who created the UN's blue helmets has come to an end, leaving behind a trail of light that time keeps trying to snuff out. But the truth behind this geopolitical mystery is finally coming to light. Conclusion. Looking back at this incredible journey of Lester B. Pearson, the big takeaway is that you can no longer ignore the power of a strategic mind in a world blinded by pride. Books like Think and Grow Rich show us that knowledge only turns into real power when it's steered by clear plans of action. And now the decision is in your hands. Are you going to keep being a mere bystander to the crises in your own life? Or are you going to start reading the signs ahead of time and drawing up your own masterstrokes? I'd love to know what you think about the courage of this Canadian who stood up to the system, so drop your comment down below so we can chat about it. And if you want to fortify your mind with more rare, deep stories like this one, subscribe to the channel right now and hit the notification bell to join our exclusive circle of thinkers.